Okay, so how did Rome feed 1 million people every single day when it grew almost none of its own food? Start with the baker, because every dinner in Rome begins there. Before dawn, he's at the oven. The flour has to be there. The grain has to have been ground. The grain has to have been shipped. The grain has to have been harvested. And every one of those steps happened somewhere else, hundreds of miles away, across open water. A city of 1 million people is a lot of bakers. It's a lot of ovens. It's a lot of bread. It's a lot of people who have to eat again tomorrow, and none of it starts in Rome. Sounds simple, it is not simple. And the story of how that bread actually reached the table, what it cost, and what happened the day it didn't show up, is one of the strangest stories in the history of money. By the end of this, you'll understand why the most important job in Rome wasn't emperor, general, or senator. It was whoever made sure the ships arrived. Let's do the math on what feeding 1 million people actually means. Now, the exact population is a scholarly debate. Some estimates run lower, closer to 500,000, but the working figure, the one historians keep coming back to, is about 1 million people, and the problem of feeding them is basically the same at any of those numbers. A single adult eats roughly a kilo of grain a day, in bread and porridge, so 1 million people is 1 million kilos a day, 10,000 tons every 10 days. Over a year, the city needs something like 200,000 tons of grain. That's an estimate, but it's a number that would strain a modern port, and it arrived by sail in pieces, in a few months, every single year. Here's a comparison that helps. The entire year's grain for Rome would have filled one very large modern cargo ship, except it didn't come in one ship, it came in hundreds of wooden vessels, driven by wind, timed to a season that could not be controlled, and every single one of those tons had to be paid for, shipped, stored, guarded, and handed out, in a world with no refrigeration, no railways, and no way to call ahead and check the weather. And the ships are the point, because Rome didn't grow this grain. Italy has good farmland. The countryside around the city could feed a town. It could not feed 1 million people packed into an area the size of a modern downtown. The city outgrew its own backyard centuries before the empire existed. So Rome did what no city had really done at that scale. It outsourced its dinner to the sea. The grain came from the edges of the empire, from Sicily, from Sardinia, from North Africa, and above all from Egypt, the richest breadbasket in the ancient world. One ancient writer put the split this way: Egypt fed Rome for about 4 months of the year, and Africa fed it for the other 8. The exact numbers are debated. The shape of it is not. Rome was fed by provinces that had been conquered, taxed, and turned into the city's pantry. Now here's the first thing nobody tells you when you picture the glory of Rome. The famous free bread, the dole, didn't feed 1 million people. It fed about 200,000 adult male citizens. The women, the children, the slaves, the foreigners, everyone else in that million, bought their food at market, at whatever price the grain fleet set that season. And that price was not gentle. When the fleet was late, grain got scarce, prices climbed, and the people without tokens ate less. When the fleet was very late, people went hungry in the greatest city on earth. And here's the part that makes the whole thing even stranger. The people who depended most on the system, the ones with no tokens at all, were the ones with the least power to complain. They couldn't vote, they couldn't riot, they just paid the price. So the dole was never a welfare program for a starving city. It was a political privilege aimed at exactly the people who showed up in the forum, voted in the assemblies, and rioted when things went wrong. The people with the grain tokens were the people with political weight, and the people with political weight were the people an emperor needed on his side. That's why the history of the dole is so telling. It started as subsidized grain in the 2nd century BC. A politician named Gaius Gracchus made the state sell grain below market price, and it was immediately a weapon. Whoever promised cheaper bread got the crowd. A few decades later, a politician named Clodius made the grain completely free, and the list of people on it exploded. By the time Julius Caesar took power, the free bread list had grown to something like 320,000 people, and Caesar did the most politically dangerous thing a Roman could do. He cut it in half, down to about 150,000. He could do that, and survive it, only because he had just won a civil war, and no one was brave enough to riot about it yet. But the lesson stuck. The bread list was too dangerous to let grow, and too dangerous to cut. And when Augustus built the empire, he settled it at around 200,000, give or take. Think about what that means. The most dangerous political number in Rome was not the size of the army. It was the size of the bread list. The man who controlled that number controlled the city. And that brings us to Egypt, because Egypt is the key to the whole machine. When Augustus took power, he did something that looks strange if you don't know the grain story. He made Egypt his personal province, his own property basically. It was governed by his own hand-picked man, and senators were forbidden from even setting foot in the province without the emperor's permission. The most powerful men in Rome were not allowed to visit the place where the bread came from. Why? Because whoever controlled the bread controlled the city. Augustus had watched the republic tear itself apart, partly through hunger, through riots, through politicians who promised free grain and delivered it with an army behind them. He was not going to leave that lever in anyone else's hands. So the emperor owned the granary province, personally, and the most powerful officer in the city after the emperor was not a general. It was the prefect of the annona, the man in charge of the grain supply. The office sat at the very top of the imperial hierarchy because in Rome, food was politics, and it stayed that way for centuries. Emperors rose and fell. Borders moved. Wars came and went. But the annona never stopped. The grain line was the one constant in Roman politics. Now let's follow the grain, because the journey is where the system starts to feel fragile. The wheat grew in the fields of Egypt and North Africa, and it moved as tax. That's the first thing to understand about the money. The bread was not paid for out of some imperial charity fund. The provinces didn't sell the grain to Rome, they gave it, because they were conquered, and the price of not being destroyed was the harvest. Barges carried the wheat down the Nile to Alexandria. At Alexandria it was loaded onto the great grain ships, enormous vessels by ancient standards. One ancient writer described a ship carrying enough grain to feed the entire city of Athens for a year. That's a description from a writer, not a shipping manifest, so take it with a pinch of salt. But the point stands. These were floating mountains. The grain they carried was the single most valuable cargo in the ancient world, and everyone in the Mediterranean knew it. And then they set sail west across the Mediterranean toward Rome, and this is where the clock starts ticking, because ancient ships could not sail whenever they felt like it. The Mediterranean shipping season ran from roughly late spring to late autumn. Winter closed the sea. Storms, no visibility, no safe harbor. No ancient captain in his right mind risked a grain fleet in December. When the sea closed, the ships were hauled ashore or moored safe. The crews paid and idle, and the city's entire year of dinner sat in warehouses waiting for spring. So the entire city's year of bread had to move in a single window, a few months of good weather, before the sea shut again. One season, one shot. Imagine the pilot of a grain ship in Alexandria, watching the sky, waiting for the wind to turn, because his cargo was not a luxury. It was the difference between dinner and no dinner for 100,000 people he would never meet. The crossing itself could take weeks with fair winds, longer without them, and the whole time the city behind him was eating its way through the granary. And if that season was bad, if the winds were wrong, if a storm took a convoy, if the harvest in Egypt came up short, there was no backup. There was no second fleet waiting in January. There was just the granary and whatever it held, and the countdown until the bread ran out. That's the arithmetic every emperor lived with. Feed the city or the city will tear you apart. And then, when the season turned, they came. You can picture the lookout on the coast, the first sail on the horizon, the word moving through the city like a rumor that turned into a holiday. The fleet arriving was the most important moment of the Roman year. Until the grain was in the harbor, the whole city was holding its breath. The difference between a good arrival and a bad one was the difference between a city that ate and a city that rioted. And the city was genuinely hard to feed, because of a problem that sounds boring and almost ended everything. The port, Rome's harbor at the mouth of the Tiber, the river port at Ostia, could not handle the grain fleet. The ships carrying the city's dinner were stacking up offshore, unable to unload, while the city behind them got hungrier. So the Emperor Claudius did what any reasonable person does when their dinner is stuck in the harbor. He built a new one, a massive new port at the mouth of the Tiber, on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen, with enormous breakwaters, warehouses and docks. And later, the Emperor Trajan expanded it into the famous hexagonal basin, an artificial harbor so well built that you can still see its shape today. The port took decades and fortunes to build, and it worked. But the fact that it had to be built at all tells you how close the whole arrangement sat to disaster. The empire literally reshaped its own coastline so it could eat. Here's where the system gets clever and a little unsettling. The grain didn't go straight from the ship to the baker. It went into vast warehouses called horae. Huge storage complexes that could hold months of grain at a time. Some of these warehouses were so big they were practically small fortresses, and the state guarded them like one. And this is the part that explains how the city survived the winter. Rome didn't run on daily arrivals, it ran on a reserve. The fleet would arrive in the good season, the granaries would fill to the roof, and then the city would slowly eat its way down through the pile all winter, waiting for the next season to refill it. The granaries were the beating heart of the city. The grain in those warehouses was, in a very literal sense, the capital of the empire. And every dawn the distribution began. A citizen with a token, a line at the granary door, a measure of grain weighed out, month after month, year after year. Every one of those measures was a promise the empire made to the city, and the empire knew exactly what happened when it broke a promise like that. The bread line was not a side effect of Roman life, it was the schedule the whole city ran on. And over time the state didn't just hand out grain. Later emperors started handing out finished bread, baked in state bakeries, and even oil and pork. The government of the ancient world's greatest empire eventually got into the business of baking your dinner for you. But here's a question most people never ask. Why did the grain show up at all? The state didn't own a fleet. Rome didn't have government cargo ships sitting around waiting for orders. The grain moved on private ships, owned by private shipowners, and the state had to make them want to do it. And this is one of the most interesting parts of the whole system, because the state didn't order the fleet into existence, it bribed it into existence. Shipowners who carried state grain got contracts, guaranteed cargo, tax exemptions, and exemptions from public duties, which were expensive obligations that could ruin you in the Roman world. They even got protection. If your ship was lost in the service of the grain supply, the state covered your losses. The greatest empire in the ancient world structured its entire maritime economy to make sure the dinner showed up, not through duty, through incentives engineered so precisely that carrying grain for Rome was the best deal a merchant could make. And if you think that sounds like a lot of fuss over shipping, consider the alternative. No incentives, no fleet, no grain, no city. The Romans did the math, and the math said pay the ship owners. Think about that the next time someone tells you the Romans were great because they were noble. The Romans were great because they paid people to be reliable, and they paid them very, very well. That's the whole logic of the Roman food system in one sentence. The empire did not feed Rome through generosity, it fed Rome through engineering, and the thing being engineered was not bread, it was obedience. And the proof of that, the moment that shows exactly how much rode on the bread line, happened in the year 41. The Emperor Claudius was in the Forum, and the grain supply had broken down. Ships weren't arriving, the granaries were running low, the city was hungry, and the crowd, the same crowd the dole was supposed to keep loyal, cornered the emperor, and pelted him with bread crusts. The ruler of the known world had to be rescued by soldiers from a mob throwing bread at his head. Read that again. The emperor of Rome, attacked over dinner. There had been shortages before, and every one of them taught the same lesson. The city could forgive a lost battle, it could not forgive a lost dinner. And Claudius learned the lesson every emperor knew, the one Augustus had known before him. Feed the city or the city will tear you apart. The emperors who followed didn't just fix the shortage, they built the machine that made the shortage less likely. Bigger harbor, better contracts, fuller granaries. Every crisis taught the same lesson, and every emperor paid the same price to learn it. Which brings us to the money, and this is the part that changes the picture. The bread was free. To the citizen with the grain token, it was free. But it was not free. Somebody paid for it. Every province that Rome conquered, taxed, and squeezed paid for it. The grain was tribute, collected as tax in kind, shipped across the sea, and handed out in Rome. Historians argue about what share of the imperial budget this whole machine consumed, because the empire didn't keep the kind of books we'd recognize. But the fact that they still argue about it tells you something. Feeding the city was not a rounding error. It was one of the biggest expenses the empire had, year after year, whether there was a war on or not. The provinces were not selling to Rome, Rome was not buying, Rome was collecting. The empire's center consumed the empire's edges in the form of dinner. The provinces grew the grain, harvested it, loaded it, and effectively paid for the bread that went to a citizen who had never planted a seed in his life. Picture the farmer in Egypt whose harvest was taken. He did not choose to feed Rome. The empire's tax collectors made the choice for him, and the grain left his dock whether he wanted it to or not. This is the part of Roman history that doesn't fit the marble statues. The greatest city in history, when you followed the grain, was a giant consumer, and its dinner came from somewhere else. The provinces didn't sell to Rome, they fed it, and the price of that dinner was never really paid back, because repayment was never the plan. Now here's the structural risk that runs through this entire system. And it's what made Rome powerful and fragile at the same time. Not a single part of the chain was in the emperor's control. He could not control the harvest. The rain falls where it falls. He could not control the wind. The sea is the sea. He could not control the weather that opened and closed the sailing season. He could only control the response to failure. He could build a bigger harbor. He could pay the shipowners more. He could fill the granaries higher, but the harvest, the season, and the sea answered to nobody. Rome's greatness rested on a single chain: a harvest in Egypt, a fleet in the right season, a safe crossing, a harbor that could unload, granaries that could hold, and a monthly distribution that kept the peace. Break any link, and the million people were one step closer to the breadline running empty. And here's the quiet circle at the heart of it all. The grain paid for the empire, and the empire kept the sea safe for the grain. Break the circle anywhere, and both halves fall. That's the structural truth underneath the whole story. Rome didn't fail because everything was bad everywhere. It failed because one piece fell out, and the rest of the structure was quietly built to depend on that piece staying in place. And for a long time, the chain held. Through the peak of the empire, through the 2nd century, when Rome was the greatest city on earth, and the grain flowed in season after season. The conditions were good, the empire was at peace, which meant the sea lanes were safe from pirates. The harvests were reliable, the fleet showed up, the granaries filled, and the city ate. That's the part of the story that's genuinely impressive. The system worked when the conditions held, but the conditions did not always hold. The grain could fail slowly, harvest by harvest, or fail suddenly in one bad season. Think about everything that had to stay true for a single dinner to exist. The province had to still be Roman, the taxes had to still be collected, the harvest had to come in, the pirates had to stay away, the wind had to blow the right way, the ships had to survive the crossing, the harbor had to be open, the granary had to hold, the bakers had to bake, and then at the end of all of that, one citizen stood in line and got his grain. That's not a food system. That's a miracle, scheduled on a calendar. The difference between a century where Rome ate and a century where Rome starved was rarely Rome itself. The city didn't change. The harvest, the sea, and the route changed. When the conditions held, the city ate and grew and built. When the conditions broke, the city shrank, and no amount of marble could feed it. And this is where the dependency finally shows its teeth. The Western Empire did not fall in a day, and it did not fall for one reason. But one thread runs straight through the collapse, and it's the same thread that ran through the city's whole existence: the grain line. When the western provinces started to fall away, the province that mattered most, North Africa, the one that fed the city for 8 months of the year, was taken. The Vandals captured Carthage in the 5th century, and when they did, they didn't just capture a city, they cut the line, the grain stopped, the granaries ran empty, and the eternal city, the city that had fed 1 million people, shrank to a fraction of its old self, because the machine that kept it alive had been dismantled. That's not the whole story of the fall. Anyone who tells you it's the single cause is selling you a simplification, but it is the structural truth underneath it. A city that cannot feed itself is not really a city. It's a machine, and a machine lives exactly as long as its fuel keeps arriving. So what was Rome, really? Look at it from the outside, and it's the greatest city in history. Marble, law, legions, empire. Look at it from the inside, from the granary, from the harbor, from the breadline, and it's something else entirely. Rome was a consumption machine. A giant, brilliant, terrifying machine for turning the harvests of conquered provinces into the daily bread of the capital. The Senate didn't run it. The generals didn't run it. The bread ran it. The emperor's real job was not to conquer the world. It was to make sure the ships arrived. Every dinner in Rome, every loaf on every table, arrived by sea, in one season, through one fragile line. And as long as that line held, Rome was the greatest city on earth. The moment that line broke, Rome was just a place where 1 million people used to live. The poet Juvenal called it bread and circuses, and he was closer to the truth than he knew. The circus kept the crowd entertained. The bread kept the city alive. So the next time you picture the glory of Rome, picture the marble, sure, but picture the baker before dawn. Picture the ships on the horizon. Picture the man in the forum, pelted with bread, because the dinner was late. That's the real Rome, not the city that conquered the world, the city that had to be fed every single day, and was.